Okay, so today we're going to talk about ancient Israel. We're going to talk about its history. We'll talk about its founders, where it comes from. We'll talk about its biggest claims to fame. Now, the first two ancient civilizations we've talked about, Mesopotamia and Egypt, what kind of religion did they have? Polytheistic. What does polytheism mean? You worship many gods, right? In some cases it can be a few. Some cases it can be 1,000. And we'll see that all throughout history, okay? So, in ancient Israel, their claim to fame, so to speak, is the creation of something called monotheism. We'll talk about that today. Okay, so the historical overview of ancient Israel tells us that it's the birthplace of three great monotheistic religions. The first one is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Now, I've already told you that monotheism means that you worship one God, right? Ancient Israel dates back all the way to 4,000 years. We get this information. Remember, we've talked about artifacts a lot, where we get our historical information from. Ancient Israel, much of it is written. It comes from places like Scripture. Comes from the Talmud, the Torah, the Holy Bible, from the Old Testament. We'll talk about great patriarchs of the Bible, great patriarchs like Abraham, Jacob, Moses, Joshua. What's patriarchs mean? We've talked about patriarchal societies already. What does that word mean? A society ran by who? Say it again? Men. Society ran by men. This one is no different in that, okay? So we'll talk about Hebrews, Israelites, Jews, and even Semites. And all of these people over or through history have undergone great persecution. This causes periods of captivity, which when they're captives, it means they're slaves, right? We'll talk about periods where they have to flee their home country. We'll talk about periods like the diaspora, where they are scattered. So all throughout history, the Jews are persecuted. So the word Hebrew means from across. This is the name given to Abraham and his followers. Israelites, Abraham's grandson Jacob. Jacob was renamed Israel. His name was changed from Jacob, which translated literally means hill catcher. Weird name, right? We'll talk a little bit more about why he has that name. Or he who has wrestled with God. You may remember the story from Scripture where Jacob wrestled with God all night. His descendants were called the Israelites. Jews were named after Jacob's son Judah, an ancient father of tribe of King David's dynasty. So Abraham is known as the father of Israel. Abraham lived in a place called Ur. This place was in Mesopotamia. We've already studied Mesopotamia, so we know one thing for sure about Mesopotamian society and their religion. It was dominated by what kind of religion? What kind of religion? Mesopotamia. Polytheism, right? So this is where Abraham lived. So history tells us, Scripture tells us, that God appeared before Abraham and told him to go and raise a great nation. Told him to leave the place where he lived and go to a land called Canaan. This place called Canaan, Abraham would settle. So God made a covenant with Abraham. This covenant's a promise. This covenant gave him a couple of promises. One, it promised him that I'm going to make a great people through you. I'm going to, through you, I'm going to make my people. And then he promised him land also. So he promised him two things. Okay, so Jacob is the grandson of Abraham. Abraham has a son. His son's name is Isaac. Isaac has a set of twins. And these twins are named Esau. Esau was born first. And Jacob. Jacob eventually becomes Israel. He organized Israelites into 12 tribes. Notice on the slide, some tribes settled in Egypt due to what?
Droughts and famine.
What's a famine?
Shortage.
Okay, so, right. So remember, during this time period, were these people civilized or were they nomadic? Nomadic, correct. So they were still nomadic to a sense where they traveled and followed the herds, followed the animals, used the land, and they ran out of food, so they had to go to Egypt and settle. We've talked about the great patriarchs of the Bible. In Jewish society, the most important patriarch is Moses. So Moses received revelations from God. What's a revelation? Does anybody know? Okay, so it's prophetic news that he's supposed to tell the people. He wrote down the first 4 books of the Bible. Moses did. Moses wrote Genesis. He wrote those books, okay? The story is, Moses goes, he sees a burning bush. That burning bush is God. God speaks to him through it. He goes to Egypt. Remember, God's children were captive in Egypt during this time. They had gone there because of lack of food. They become slaves. After they become slaves, they've been there for a long period of time. Very long period of time. Generations and generations and generations. So for many of them, that's all they knew was slavery. God spoke to Moses and told him to go to Egypt and set the people free. He did that. After leaving, God's children left Egypt. They traveled through the desert. Moses receives the 10 Commandments. And the 10 Commandments, if you look at the 10 Commandments, the interesting thing about those is the first 2 commandments. The first one says, you shall have no other God before me. The second one is, you shouldn't worship any other graven image. What do we know that the Egyptians were and the Mesopotamians were? What kind of religion? That's right. So the first 2 commandments deal directly with that you should worship no other gods. So this is a commandment for what? What kind of religion? Nope. Monotheism. Right. So this is, that tradition had already been started, but this is a commandment that's stating you can worship no other God. So the first 4 commandments deal with man and God directly. So after the children leave for the desert, God's children leave for the desert, they're disobedient. You know the story, I'm sure a lot of you do. They're disobedient, and for that reason they're made to wander the desert for 40 years. So 1230 BCE, the Israelites, guided by Joshua, invaded Canaan, the promised land. The first king of the Israelites was Saul. Then you had David, then you had David's son named Solomon. Under King David, the Israelites captured the city of Jerusalem. King Solomon built the temple at Jerusalem. Okay, so we have to remember that when we look at the temple in itself, what architecture does it follow after? Where had the Hebrews been? Where had they been prior to going to the promised land? What ancient civilization had they been in? Egypt, and there's another one. So Mesopotamian and Egyptian architecture plays a great role in what becomes architecture in Israel. Solomon's temple was destroyed during the Babylonian invasion. It was rebuilt in the 6th century BCE and destroyed again. in 70 CE by the Romans. Only remaining part of Solomon's temple today is the Western Wall. You can still see that today. You can still see, many people refer to it as the Wailing Wall, but it is a wall in Jerusalem where people go to pray today. So the diaspora literally means sowing of seed or dispersal, which refers to Jewish population living outside of Israel. Okay, we mentioned the word covenant already, but it's definitely important that you understand its impact. A covenant is a formal agreement. This covenant is between the Hebrews and God. The Hebrews worship God and only God, and in return they would be God's chosen people. And they were given the land of Canaan as the promised land. Now, do they have that land today? Yeah, they do, partly. But there's somebody else that claims it also. Who else claims that? Okay, we'll talk about that in a minute. So, spiritual ideas profoundly influence Western culture, morality, ethics, and conduct. Three of the world's most dominant religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are all derived the roots from spiritual beliefs of the ancient Israelites.